Hi everyone, welcome to the Capital Farm Credit Facebook Live Lunch and Learn. My name is Tiffany Lashmet. I'm an Extension Ag Law Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I'm based here in our Amarillo Research and Extension Center, and my responsibilities are to cover the state of Texas and educate folks on different agricultural law issues that come up for farmers and ranchers and landowners here in our state. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to be here today to chat about agricultural leases, which is one of my favorite topics. Hold on 1 second. I think we may have a malfunction with the phone. Okay, Sarah, am I up and down now or am I still sideways? Okay. Okay, Sarah, how's that? Well, I'll tell you what happened. We practiced with all of our fancy technology, and when it came go time, none of that worked. So we'll just use some baling wire and spit and hope for the best. Like I said, my name is Tiffany Lashmet. I'm an Extension Ag Law Specialist with Texas A&M, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about agricultural leases with you as part of this Lunch and Learn for Capital Farm Credit. Before we start on that, I have some breaking news that I wanted to mention. Capital is a great supporter of our extension programs, and next week we're having our Texas Extension Specialists Association meeting that was supposed to be in San Marcos, but since everything is a little bit upside down right now, or sideways like the phone, we are going to be unable to have that meeting. If we had been there next week, Capital Farm Credit was going to be getting this plaque, which is our Outstanding Friend of Extension Specialist Award. And so I wanted to mention that here on the live today. We'll get this plaque to them at a better time, but we really appreciate the support of everybody at Capital. So many of you that I work with, Sarah and Tanya and Pat, are great, and we really appreciate their support. So I want to thank them again for everything they've done for our programs. So let's start off, we're calling this Ag Lease 101, and I want to start with just some resources that we have related to agricultural leases. Kind of ag law in general, I've got two main resources that might be useful to you all. The first one is a blog. It's the Texas Agricultural Law blog. You can just Google that, it'll pop right up. Or the website is agrilife.org/TexasAgLaw. And Sarah is going to put links to everything I mentioned here in the comments, so you can just click right on her links if you'd like to check them out. That blog is sort of the clearinghouse for all the information that I've got related to agricultural law. And so if you want to go there and find any sort of handbooks that I've done, or checklists, or anytime a new case comes out or there's something happening, I post it there. So feel free to check that out if you're interested in ag law sort of in general. When you go there, you're going to see quite a bit of information related to leases, as that's a topic I work extensively in. I've also got a podcast. So if you are a podcast listener, it's called Ag Law in the Field. You can listen on anywhere you listen to your podcasts, right? iTunes, the podcast app, Google Play, Stitcher. If none of that made any sense to you, don't panic. I've got you covered. You can just go to our website. And the website for that is aglaw.libsyn.com. Again, Sarah will have a link in the comments. You can just go there, and what you're going to find is about 85 interviews I have done with ag lawyers on different topics. And so all you've got to do is just scroll down and find the topic you want, push play, and that information's there for free. It's just audio interviews. You don't need video. It should stream hopefully fine on your internet, kind of wherever you are. And so if that's useful, feel free to check that out. There are several episodes related to leases. There's an episode specifically on hunting leases, a separate one on grazing leases, a third one on farm leases. There's landowner liability and water law and fence law and estate planning. Kind of you name it, we have it there. So feel free to check that out. And again, that's at aglaw.libsyn.com. So 3 more resources related to leases, and then we're going to kind of get into our conversation. One thing that I want to mention we do is some live agricultural leasing workshops. We call them the Ranchers Agricultural Leasing Workshop. We hold those events around the state. I'm going to give you the dates we have scheduled for the rest of 2020 with the caveat of we don't know if they're going to happen or not, to be frank with you. Right now, they're still scheduled. We're sure hopeful we can do them. We'll just have to sort of wait and see. So our next one is scheduled for September 14th. That's going to be in Fredericksburg. Then we're going to be in Abilene on September 29th and in Lemming, which is down around San Antonio, on October the 6th. Again, we're hopeful that those will happen. If they get canceled, obviously everyone will get a full refund of any registration fee that you have paid. And if you're interested in those, you can go to our registration page. Sarah will share a link for that. It's just at agriliferegister.tamu.edu/aglaw. So another resource that's available where you don't have to leave your house, and this has really been kind of a perfect timing with the whole COVID situation, is we have an online version of that Ranchers Agricultural Leasing Workshop. It's essentially the same program. We went to a studio and just recorded our presentations, and you can watch that on your computer at your own pace. Anytime you want, you can go back and review certain sections, and that's, I think, been really useful for people. It costs $75 to take that course. Again, it's online. For more information on that, Sarah will put a link in the notes as well. It's available anytime to register, and you can just go to the link that Sarah will put up or contact me. I'll make sure and give you my info at the end. Very last thing, another free resource for you is our Ranchers Agricultural Leasing Handbook. We hand this hard copy handbook out. Looks like this. We give these out at all of our leasing workshops. It's about a 100-page handbook with different things in it, from checklists to sample lease language to articles on setting lease rates and landowner liability. A hard copy you can obtain from my office. They cost $25. That's because of printing and shipping. If you want to just download the PDF for free, you can do that on my blog. Again, Sarah's going to put a link up, or you can go to the Texas Agriculture Law blog, published materials. Free download is yours for the taking. So that's just a little bit of resources to kind of go home with. So today, as we look at our time together, we don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to try to hit on sort of 3 issues we get maybe the most questions on when we're talking about leases that I think might be the most useful for people. And as you guys have questions, if you will type those in the chat box, I am more than happy to answer those. I'll try to check those as we go along, and I'll certainly make sure we leave some time at the end to answer your questions. The first question I want to answer is, do I really have to put my lease in writing? I get this question a lot from extension clientele, from my own father, from my husband, of course. So I understand the question. And the answer is, really, your ag leases should be in writing. I know. You're going to complain. You're going to cringe. I get it. Let me talk you through why I think this is something that's really important. The first thing is, having a written lease is not some sort of sign that you don't trust the other party, all right? I hear that sometimes, and I think it's the opposite. I think what a written lease can do is protect the relationship between the landowner and the tenant, right? And make sure that they've got an ongoing relationship from here on, especially if you're friends with them, right? We want to make sure we protect that relationship, which is likely more important to you than the lease anyway. So using a lease can really help to do that. One thing I'll say too, writing a lease does not have to be something adversarial. Please don't think that you have to lawyer up and fight over terms. You can do that if you want, but you sure don't have to. I've seen some great leases that have been written at kitchen tables where, the landowner and the tenant sat down together and hammered out a lease, and they agreed to address a bunch of potential issues. And so just keep that in mind. I think that's really important. From the technical legal perspective, another reason to have written leases is something called the statute of frauds. And the way that works is that in general in Texas and in most other states, oral leases, right, verbal leases are valid, right? They're valid lease agreements, valid contracts. But the statute of frauds says there are certain kinds of contracts that have to be in writing to be legally enforceable. One of those is a lease of real estate that lasts a year or more. And so if you're going to enter into a long-term lease, right, a 2, 5, 10-year lease, if you don't have that lease in writing, it is not a legally enforceable contract. And where that really becomes a problem is if you end up in a dispute with the other party. Because if that happens, right, you're going to want to go to court and file a breach of contract claim. Guess what the first thing a court's going to look for in a breach of contract claim is? The existence of a valid contract. All right? So for sure, if you've got a lease that's over a year long, it really needs to be in writing because of the statute of frauds. And again, that's certainly the rule in Texas. Most states I know of have similar provisions for leases that are longer than a year. Another reason to have a written lease is there may be other agencies that need a copy of that. So for example, if leasing is something that's going on your property and you're using that to justify your open space valuation at the appraisal district, which is really important here in Texas for a lot of us, right? They may need a copy of the lease for their files. To give them a copy, you have to have something written down. Same situation comes up at the Farm Service Agency office, FSA, and at the Natural Resource Conservation Service office. If you're going to enter into any sort of programs, right? So if you're going to be looking at enrolling in ARC or PLC or EQIP or something like that, if you've got leased property, they're going to want a copy of the lease. And one reason for that, frankly, is to know if you qualify and then to determine who to pay under those programs. They have to know how that lease is structured. The last thing I'll say as far as needing to have leases in writing is you just never know what might happen. When I do these programs live, I show a picture of my dad on a horse next to my city boy cousin from Switzerland. And I sort of make a joke, right, that if you've got a lease with my dad, you're probably fine because he's been around agriculture his whole life. He's been a landowner, he's been a tenant, he raises cattle. You're probably not going to run into too many problems. But heaven forbid something happens to my dad and the land gets inherited by my Swiss cousin. And now you've got a landowner who doesn't know anything about agriculture, right? They don't understand when you do things or what's normal or how come you're branding those calves, right? Who knows what you're going to run into. And in that scenario, you're going to want to have a written lease, all right? And frankly, the flip is true as well. Let's say that you're a landowner now and at some point in the next decade or so, your kids are going to inherit the land. You don't want to have kids that get taken advantage of by a tenant because there's not a written lease agreement. And when we think about the dynamics here in Texas of, huge generational transfer of land is going to be occurring, we're going to have more and more absentee landowners. Having the certainty of a written lease agreement, really we just can't overstate how important that is now and is going to be in the future. So that's my pitch on getting those leases in writing. They don't have to be super complicated. You don't have to use a bunch of legalese, but get something down on paper. Walk through and address all the what ifs you can think of that might cause a problem in the lease. I think that that's something that's really valuable to take the time to do. Okay, so the next topic that I want to talk about, and again, if you've got questions, put them in the chat box. I'm going to get to them at the end of our time today. Is how much is the lease worth, right? If I'm the landowner, I want to know how much can I charge? And if I'm the tenant, I want to know how much do I have to pay? And there's some statistics I can give you on that. Really, I'm just going to point you to where you can go look this up for your own area. I think that hopefully it's useful information. The first thing that I'll mention is you've got to figure out what kind of lease you're dealing with as far as how it's structured. So for ag leases, there's kind of three ways that leases are generally put together. By far the most common is a cash lease. All right, and that's where we just agree to a certain cash payment that's set by the terms of the lease. A lot of times that'll be so many dollars per acre per year. Sometimes you'll see so many dollars per head on a grazing lease. That's a cash lease. We also, especially with row crops, can sometimes see share leases. That you're probably all familiar with this, right? That's what it sounds like. The landlord and the tenant share in certain expenses and then share in the profits from raising the crop. And so those leases, again, more common with row crops. A lot of times you'll see those where the landowner gets either a quarter or a third, and the tenant gets the rest. So that's another option just to be aware of. And then a third type of lease that we see pop up every now and again is what's called a flex lease. It's sort of a combination of the two. So what you might see in a flex lease is it would say, we're gonna have a lease rate of so many dollars per acre for you to grow corn. But if the price of corn gets above $4, the lease is gonna increase by 25 cents or whatever the numbers you wanna use, okay? Vice versa, right? Usually the opposite is true as well. If the price falls below $3.60, the rent's gonna go down by a certain amount. So that's a way to sort of put the two of them together, and the lease flexes based on some external factor. Usually that's price or yield, but that can be another way to look at these leases and as far as how they're structured. As far as what should you charge, it's really pretty dependent. I'm gonna give you two resources to go look at as far as where to find those. Sarah has linked the first one here for you. It's the USDA National Ag Statistics Service. Every year they do a survey of lease rates around the country and they publish those results. In odd numbered years like 2019, they actually are gonna have results for every county in the United States. And they split them out into pasture land, dry land cropland, and irrigated cropland. And you can go look up the average in your county or in your region or in your state if you want to do that. I pulled just a couple of numbers this morning just to give you kind of the range here in Texas. For pasture land, the range in that USDA NASS report is from $1.20 per acre out in the Trans-Pecos, right, so far west Texas, up to $13.50, which is the black lands, and northeast Texas, both those areas are $13.50 an acre. And all of these numbers I'm going to talk about are figures that are stated as per acre per year. So that would be $1.20 per acre per year in the Trans-Pecos and $13.50 per acre per year in the Blacklands in northeast Texas. For dryland cropland, the range went from $17.50 in the Cross Timbers region to $62 an acre in the Coastal Bend region. And then for irrigated cropland, the range was $45 in the Cross Timbers region. And not surprisingly, here in the northern high plains was the highest, and their average was $110 per acre. So that's a resource. Again, there's a link there. I will warn you that that link, that website, it's a database of every county in the U.S., and it can be a little difficult to navigate just because it's kind of a pain to scroll up and down. If you have trouble, shoot me an email. I'll give you the numbers that you need. I don't mind doing that. I've got it saved on my computer. Okay, the second resource for looking at how much to charge is the Texas Rural Land Value Trend Report. I know that's a mouthful, but it's essentially a report that's put out by a group of rural appraisers every year, and it breaks the state of Texas down into 7 regions. For each region, it breaks land into different categories. So, for example, they've got irrigated pasture, good water, fair water, poor water, native pasture, improved pasture. Some areas they might have like ranchettes, right, or less than 50 acres. And they split this all up and they tell you the average purchase price and the average rental rates for each region, and then they break them into sub-regions. So really useful information you can find there. I just pulled a couple of numbers for random areas of the state. For the South Plains, right, so kind of that Amarillo to Lubbock area, if you had irrigated cropland with good water, the average was $150 to $200 an acre. In the hill country, if you had improved pasture, the lease rate there was $15 to $30 an acre. The other interesting thing that this report does is they give us average prices for hunting leases. And to my knowledge, this is the only like official report that does so. And hunting leases are from $6 to $25 an acre. And that really ranges depending on where you are in the state. Not surprisingly, the 25 amount is kind of the closer that you get to Fredericksburg in the hill country. And on hunting leases, just FYI, sometimes you'll see them done as a per acre fee. A lot of times you see them done as like a per gun fee. So instead of pricing it by the acre, it's, you know, by the hunter or the gun, or the number of guns, etc. So maybe for a deer, you'd see, you know, $5,000 a person or something like that. Okay, so that's just some places to find the information on rates. I also always recommend folks talk to their county extension agents and talk to other landowners and producers in the area, because look, these averages are as good as people kind of reporting the numbers. And so I don't think there's ever anything better than real information from people who are on the ground doing the work. So we have that as well. Another term, another section I want to talk about here, kind of to wrap it up before we get to questions, is some key terms to consider when you're drafting a lease. I try to pull out a few different topics for different types of leases here. I just want to mention these. And again, if you get the ag leasing handbook or download the PDF, there are like 8-page long checklists for each type of lease. I'm not saying that you can get away with a lease with only one term, but we just don't have time to go through all of them today. So for all leases, one thing I would mention is you need to make sure, whether it's a grazing lease, a hunting lease, a farm lease, that you limit the type of activity that can be done on the property. So for example, if I lease my land to someone to graze cattle, but I don't say that in the lease, right? The lease just says, I lease my land to so-and-so. Then what happens when they show up with a bunch of kids on four-wheelers and they bring people to go swimming in the swimming hole and they're shooting off fireworks, or they think they have the hunting rights? That comes up a lot as well. And so just really spell out what the tenant has the right to do. And if you're the tenant and there's something specific you want to do, have that spelled out as well. Make sure that it's included on there. Another issue that can come up if you're leasing to someone who's not from your area, so this happens a lot with hunting leases, you may want to think about what's called a forum selection clause. What that would say, so I live in Carson County. If I was going to enter into a hunting lease with someone maybe from Dallas, I would put in the lease that any dispute about this lease must be heard in Carson County. Right, so in other words, if we get in a spat and someone's gonna file a lawsuit, you file it on my turf, not yours, right? And there's two advantages to that. The first one is obviously home court advantage in a courtroom, right? We're picking a jury, I want my friends there. And then number two, right, just the hassle of having to leave town or hire a lawyer somewhere else to deal with an issue. Again, this really only matters if you're leasing to somebody who's not from your area. If you're leasing with your neighbor, you don't need a forum clause. When we're looking at grazing leases, I think the number one thing to think about there is a stocking rate. And that brings up a really good point. When you're looking at any sort of checklist or sample lease, you've got to make it fit you. And one question that you need to ask is this term helping me or hurting me? Okay, so here's what I mean. If I'm the landowner, the very first term I'm writing in a grazing lease is going to be a stocking rate, because that's really important to me, right? I do not want a tenant coming in and turning out every cow he's ever seen, grazing my grass down to nothing, and then I'm left with it at the end of the year when he's gone, can't lease it to anybody else, can't put my own cattle out there, probably gonna lose my open space valuation at the appraisal district, and it's probably gonna blow my dirt everywhere when the wind blows, right? I don't want to be part of that. So a stocking rate is gonna be the number one thing I ask for. If I'm a tenant, I'm probably not fighting to have a stocking rate in my lease, right? I'll agree to one if you ask, but that's not a term I'm gonna be putting in a draft if I'm the one drafting it, okay? Because I don't wanna be limited on how many animals I can put out there. So just think about that kind of from both sides, and if you're looking at any sort of checklist, make sure you only use what you is helpful to you when you're drafting or negotiating on those leases. As far as farm leases go, right, row crop leases, make sure if you've got a share lease, you're gonna spell out the details of that. I can't tell you how many times people have misunderstandings on how that's gonna work. So let's say you enter into a lease on the quarters for cotton, and that's pretty common, I think, around the Lubbock area, right? A quarter to the landowner, 3/4 to the farmer, the tenant. And normally on those type of leases, you would share the fertilizer costs. But what if you as the tenant thought they were also going to share other costs, like herbicides or irrigation costs or seed costs, right? But the landowner didn't think that. Now we've got a problem, right? Where you thought you were going to get help on costs, they didn't think that was included. You need to spell out exactly what's included in a share lease and what's going to be split and not. That's really important. Another thing important on share leases, if you are the landowner and you want certain records from the tenant to know how much you are going to be on the hook for, spell that out too, right? Do you want receipts from the co-op? Do you want, certain information on how he segregated this from all the other places he's farming? Whatever. Just make sure you spell that out, because I've seen fights on that pop up as well. Last thing on hunting leases, one of the biggest issues if you've got hunters is potential liability. And frankly, that's something that you should be concerned about, right? And this is true if you're going to let anybody on your land for some sort of recreational activity. And so if you're going to have hunters come out, I always recommend you get a waiver signed by the hunters. So anybody who's going to come on the property needs to sign just a general liability waiver. I would recommend you use a lawyer to draft one up. Getting that done should not be super expensive. If you find a lawyer that does a lot of these, they probably have a form. They can just fill in the info. And then you can use that for probably the next 20 years because the law on that doesn't change all that often. But having that waiver can be really important. So I would recommend that for sure. The other thing I would recommend is if you're going to have anybody on your property for recreational uses like hunting, fishing, swimming, anything like that, four-wheelers, there are a couple of statutes you need to be aware of in Texas that offer you limited liability protection if you take some really simple steps. Those are the Texas Recreational Use Statute and the Texas Agritourism Act. I've got info about those on my blog. You can go look it up. But I would sure take the time to read about those two statutes because they are a really great way to get some additional protection for Texas landowners with pretty minimal effort on your part to make sure that they are applicable. Okay, so with that was kind of my spiel that I had on sort of common issues I see, some resources for you to be aware of. I'm certainly happy to take questions here as we go. So if you all have questions on ag leases, please feel free to ask them now. I will do my best here to read them and see if I can answer them. The other thing I'll offer, I guess Sarah may kick me off, but if you have other ag law questions that are just kind of general questions, I'm happy to answer those too. So shoot them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to try to answer those here as we wrap up. So I see one question here. When you see, when we're talking about the statute of frauds, right? And remember I said that a contract that's over a year or more has to be in writing to be legally enforceable. The question is, when you say legally enforceable, is that enforced through a suit or something else? Also, if in court, is that county or district or some other court level? So yeah, when we talk about a contract being legally enforceable, that matters because the question is going to be whether or not you can go to court and try to enforce that contract. And probably it would be a court issue. Potentially it's something you could deal with through mediation or arbitration. Those are just sort of some alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that I think are really helpful. They can be a lot cheaper and a lot faster than court as well. But again, you'd need to have a valid contract to be successful on any sort of claim wherever you were going to make that. As far as where they're filed, it's going to be filed generally in the court in the county where the land is located. And it may depend on the claim or the amount of the claim, whether it's specifically going to be in the county court or district court at law. So that may be a little bit more dependent, but generally it's going to be in the county where the land is located. Unless there's some sort of forum clause like we talked about where the parties agreed to do something else. Okay, and I see a couple other questions coming here, so give me 1 second. I will read those. What type of liability insurance is recommended for grazing leases, especially with contract labor working cattle? Good question, Beverly. So I'm going to give you the answer, and then I'm going to tell you why my concern about contract labor working cattle has increased over the last 2 weeks. The answer as far as liability insurance, You just need to make sure that you've got liability insurance that covers everything you're doing on your property. So it may be that that's called a farm and ranch policy. It might be called a commercial farm and ranch policy. It might just be called a liability policy. The name doesn't matter as much as the coverage. So what you want to do is work with your insurance agent, make sure that they're aware, right, that you've got cattle on your property, you've got people that come help work them. We want to make sure our policy covers that specific thing. All right, and we're going to probably talk about landowner liability maybe another time on this, but let me just tell you, having liability insurance is probably the most important thing any landowner or tenant can do to protect themselves, right? Because you need that insurance. If somebody gets injured, not only does the insurance obviously provide you kind of a policy limit that they'll pay damages, but it also provides you a defense, right? Where that means the insurance company is going to be hiring you a lawyer on their dime to deal with the case. Super important. As far as how much insurance you want to have, it depends on what you're doing. The only kind of guideline I can give you is if you're going to have recreational or educational activities on the property, like hunting, you want to at least have the amount of insurance that's listed in the recreational use statute. We don't have time to get into the details here, but there's an amount listed in that statute. It's $500,000 per person, $1 million per occurrence, and $100,000 for property damage. I would have at least that much insurance if I had recreational users because of that statute. Okay, the last thing that I want to say is on that part is umbrella policies. I think that there's some misinformation and almost like false sense of security with an umbrella policy. Now hear me, there's nothing wrong with having an umbrella policy. They're great. It can be a great way to add additional dollars of coverage to your insurance. But because they're called umbrella, a lot of times people will say, well, I don't have to worry about what's covered and what's not because I have an umbrella policy and we think that covers everything. That's not how they work. An umbrella policy sits on top of a regular liability policy. So I got a liability policy that spells out this is covered, this isn't. All that the umbrella does is give you additional dollars of coverage. So maybe it takes a $500,000 policy to a $2 million policy. It does not increase the scope of that coverage to include different activities. Does that make sense? So I would prefer to see it called a top hat policy because it just sits on top and gives us more dollars. It doesn't increase the scope like we think an umbrella might. So there's that. The question about specifically ranch hands that maybe come and help brand or things like that. I would have said up until last week that there's a statute called the Texas Farm Animal Liability Act that would protect you. And then the Texas Supreme Court issued an opinion in a case called Walk. You can go to my blog. It's about 2 blogs ago because I did a whole post on it. And that case said that the Farm Animal Liability Act is not a defense if the injured party is a ranch hand or a rancher. And in that case, they were moving a bull and somebody got killed. And the court said that that statute doesn't apply as a defense for the bull owner. Frankly, I'll be honest with you, it was a kind of a shocking decision for me. It certainly is not how I had read the statutes. And so that used to be a protection. It's not anymore. I would certainly make sure with my insurance company that any sort of, day labor or ranch hands or anybody like that coming out to help is covered under my liability policy. I think that that's probably the best protection you've got there. Okay, Sarah, would safety protocols be recommended in the lease or separately from a tenant for hunting or fishing properties? Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. If you're going to have somebody come hunt on your property, do you want to list in safety protocols that they need to take? If that's something that you want to list, the lease is the place to do it, right? And you want to make sure that you have everybody who's coming sign that lease so they're all bound by the terms. Does that make sense? So if I come hunt, but I didn't sign the lease, my husband did, or my brother did, but I just come with him, I'm not bound by the terms of that lease unless I've signed it. So first of all, I'd make sure everybody signs it. And I do think listing some safety protocols is a really good idea. I've seen things like no alcohol or drug use on the lease. A good one is you have to follow all state and federal rules and regulations related to hunting. Any sort of safety things like that, I think it's smart to include. And yes, the lease is the place where I would include those. Okay, any other questions before we wrap it up? Okay, the last thing, I'll give anybody a chance to type here. If you guys have follow-up questions afterwards, or if you need information, please contact me. My email address, I'm gonna just tell you it. It's tdowell@tamu.edu. So T like Tiffany, TDOWELL @tamu.edu. You can also check out my Facebook page. It's just Texas Agriculture Law Blog. If you go there, you'll find me. You can leave me a message there. I'll sure be glad to help however I can. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for coming, and thanks to Capital Farm Credit for hosting this event. Hopefully we get to do it again soon. Thank you.